Alright, AP Psych friends, this is it. There is one more video after this. Take a moment to revel in the glory of completing an entire year of AP Psych. Okay, that's enough time. We'll revel more after video 3. But Social Psychology, Unit 14, this is part 2 on social influence. So let's talk about how individuals can, we talked a little bit about persuasive speaking in the first video, but let's talk more about, how groups or how the other can influence our own behavior. And so the first topic that's mentioned in this section is the issue of conformity. Okay, adjusting one's behavior or thinking to coincide with some group standard. The famous study that was done that you learned about in 40 Studies was that of Solomon Asch, right? The different sizes of lines, and that when individuals were asked, which line is longer, they were willing to change their answer to an incorrect one if it seemed like they were the only person in the group that was not conforming to a specific answer. Like line B is the longest, when in reality it was line C. And so on pretty simple tasks, Asch's study shows that people, they're willing to conform or change their answer in an to fall in line with what the group is saying or believing. There are some conditions that strengthen the likelihood that conformity will happen. Right? Whenever an individual feels incompetent or insecure, right, they're more likely to conform. When the group doing the pressuring, so to speak, has at least 3 people, right? So the bigger the group, the more likely people are to conform. When the group is unanimous, right? You're the only one not agreeing with the group, it makes it pretty hard to not conform. If one admires the group's status or attractiveness, right? This desire to be a part of the group. If somebody has no prior commitments to any response, like they have no opinion, it's more easy to persuade them. If others in the group are observing their behavior, right, they feel like they're being watched and that everybody's waiting for the decision. And of course, in cultures that have high respect for social standards, conformity is easier in those situations too. And when we talk about conformity, we can talk about normative social influence and informational social influence. Okay, normative is just the desire to gain approval or avoid disapproval from the group. So that, right, to fall in line with the group's norms is why a person will conform. Informational would be just a person's willingness to accept others' opinions, right? Like, okay, give me your side of the story, persuade me, give me the information, that you have to present for your side, would be more of informational social influence. Now, Barron altered Asch's experiment to use, rather than lines, to use people's faces, followed by a lineup of suspects. And when the accuracy seemed important, like when members of the study were told that this was an actual police lineup, they rarely conformed when the task was easy. Right? When they were told this was crucial, they would rarely conform. But when it was really hard, like when the pictures looked really similar, or they were unsure if they'd picked the right person or not, they were more receptive to others' opinions. So even on important tasks, if the decision is a hard one to make, Barron's research shows that still conformity to the majority is pretty easy to do. Asch and Barron and Milgram, that we'll talk about in a minute. All of their research on conformity and obedience, is coming obviously out of, what we learned from, the lessons of the Holocaust. And these researchers wanted to know, like, is there a psychological reason that people, didn't stand up to the Nazi regime? And it's fascinating. When you look at cases of the Holocaust or other examples of brutality or abuse from like a government to its people, to see how often these sorts of psychological phenomenon play a role. But I digress. Obedience. That obviously Stanley Milgram's experiment is the most famous here, right? That was the one where he got people to believe they were shocking individuals for incorrect answers on these vocabulary quizzes. The results showed this: obedience was higher when the authority figure was close by, when the participant perceived that authority figure as having real power, when the study was associated with a prestigious institution, like when Milgram would tell them that this is something Yale is doing versus, some other university. When the victim was depersonalized or at a distance, right? When they couldn't see the person they were injuring, it made it a lot easier for them to do. Or when others, when other defiant or dissidents were not seen, right? There's safety in numbers. If they could hear another participant speaking up like, no, this doesn't seem right, it made it easier for them to step forward. And so it's quite fascinating to see all of these, ingredients that make the recipe for obedience, and looking to historical examples and seeing, Milgram's ideas really do apply. And also to connect it to video 1, right? Stanley Milgram certainly used the foot in the door technique, right? Didn't he start out with small voltages and then slowly would increase and increase to the point where the participant felt, well, I've come this far, how can I say no? And so fascinating research to discuss concerning social psych. Okay. Group influence, not under the categories of conformity and obedience. There are some other things that we can talk about. Social facilitation. We tend to have stronger performance in the presence of others, right? When you feel like people are watching and relying on you, you tend to do a better job. Social loafing, right? You tend to exert less effort when pulling efforts towards attaining a common goal, right? Versus being individually accountable, right? The classic conundrum of assigning group work, right? As a teacher, right? How do you keep everyone accountable to prevent social loafing? It's hard to do. De-individuation is losing self-awareness and, as a result, losing self-restraint in situations that foster arousal and anonymity, right? So if you, right, in the case of the Milgram experiment, right, if you could torture somebody but they didn't know it was you, if you could hide or you couldn't see your victim, it made it a lot easier to do. That's a great example of de-individuation. Wearing a mask while committing a robbery, de-individuation. Fascinating to think about. Group polarization is the enhancement of attitudes as a result of being with a group, right? So, birds of a feather flock together, but the problem with that is that like-minded people only enhance their already similar attitude, and hence the creation of extremist groups, right? If you refuse to listen to any other people's opinions but ones that align with your own, there's a good chance that you will become more and more extreme in this. Okay. Groupthink makes me always think of 1984, one of my favorite books. But it's the mode of thinking where there's this desire for harmony amongst the group, that we're not going to really entertain any alternatives, right? Like, well, no, this is, like, I always think classic groupthink, like, this is the way we've always done it, and why would you want to challenge it? Why would you want to go and make waves and go against tradition? Those are some pretty common, like, groupthink type attitudes. Okay. Related to social influence, right? Cultural influence plays a huge role, right? In that your culture creates the social norms that you have to follow, and also the type of culture you live in, and whether it's an individualist culture or a collectivist culture. Like, you can obviously tell that even, this lecture is being approached from a Western individualist concept, and that, all the examples of conformity and obedience, groupthink are negative ones, when really in a collectivist culture we could focus a lot on the positives of these types of things, and the amount of things that can be accomplished when people work as a group and focus less on themselves. And so, culture plays a role in that. Being a part of a Western individualist culture, I have a hard time seeing any of the benefits of conformity, when I'm sure there are indeed many. So it's just something to think about. And to end on social influence, right, the power of individuals, right? Committed individuals can sway the majority, right? And they don't always have to be extraordinary people. Like it comes to mind, like, a Martin Luther King Jr. or a Gandhi, right? They can be everyday people as well. And so, even though this slide makes it feel like the group is always having control and the individual is always having to resist the powers of the group, committed individuals really can sway majority opinion. And, movements have to start with someone, right? And so I guess a good positive end there, right? That, being, committed to a cause, whether you're one of many or standing alone for a cause that you believe is good. I mean, don't give up thinking that you can't persuade others in your charge. Zimbardo talks a lot about that in the lecture. I'm not sure if you're watching this before you've seen it or after you've seen it, since I've posted this early. So okay, bring any questions that you have with you concerning social influence to class, and we can discuss them at that time. And the only thing left to discuss then is going to be social relations, where we'll talk about all sorts of interesting topics like prejudice, aggression, and levels of attraction. So stay tuned. That will be your final video for this class. So as always, thanks for listening.